Hello, this is Reverend Don Lewis coming to you from the beautiful metaverse, and more specifically from beautiful Danville, Illinois, homeland of the Correllian tradition. And this is Midday with Reverend Don. Welcome. And as you know, if you follow Midday with Reverend Don, you can type your comments or questions directly into whatever platform you happen to be watching on if you're watching live, and they'll show up here in my chat room, and we can talk directly. And today I'm going to talk about the Correllian Lustration. And of course, the reason for this is that the lustration is coming up this weekend, and it will be running from May 16th through May 19th, and you can learn more at correllian.com/lustration-2024.html. And all this week, I'm going to be focusing on lustration issues, and I wanted to start by talking about what a lustration is. And if you follow Midday with Reverend Don, you probably already know this, but we're going to do it again. And maybe in a little more detail than usual. So the Correllian lustration is a blessing with lustral water, that is, water blessed with light. And in this case, energetic light. The idea of using lustral water for a blessing is very ancient, very widespread. And hello to Reverend Eric in the chat room. It's good to see you. And Reverend Eric says, I so look forward to seeing you in a few days at Lustration. Absolutely. And in the ceremony, the water blessed with light is used to bless the entirety of the tradition. And this was a common form of blessing in the ancient world. It's common in many cultures today. And it is the central act of the Correllian lustration and where the name comes from. In recent years, the term lustration has also been used in some other circles in more negative senses, but that's not how we're using the term. We're using it in its traditional religious sense, which is purification by water blessed with light. And if we talk historically about lustral water, we're usually talking about water that's blessed with either the light of the sun or the moon at particular times. If you bless water under the full moon, for example, that's lustral water. But when we use energy and think of it as a form of light, this too is a way of creating lustral water, and that's what we do in the lustration. The central act in the lustration is to channel the blessing of the Correllian ancestors into the water, which will be used for the lustration itself. And we have been doing this blessing with lustral water a very long time, as far back as I can remember, but it was not a public ceremony until, I want to say, year 2 Aquarius, 2002. And we decided to make it into a public ceremony because a lot of people at that time felt the need for extra protection. They felt the need for extra blessing. I don't remember what was making them feel that need at the time, but you know, people are always in need of extra blessing. And we decided it would be good to make it into a public twice annual event. And we have the lustration of the ancestors, which occurs in the northern hemisphere in the spring, and the lustration of the living, which occurs in the northern hemisphere in the fall. Both honor the ancestors, both honor the living, but one puts greater emphasis than the other on each of these. And for many people, the idea of the way the lustration is arranged, honoring the ancestors in what in the northern hemisphere is the spring, and honoring the living in what in the northern hemisphere is the fall, seems counterintuitive, but you have to remember the Correllian tradition is an old tradition. We've been terming ourselves Wiccan since the late 1970s, but we go back much longer than that. And many of our ideas come from other earlier sources. The reason for the lustration of the ancestors being in the spring is for the influence of the ancestors to grow along with the psychic tide. And the reason for the blessing of the living to be in the fall is for the harvest of new life. And that was the idea behind it. Together with the fact that, it's just what they did. Um, there may be other reasons no one remembers, but those are the reasons I understand. And it also allowed, with the illustration of the ancestors, to be fairly public with a relatively private celebration around the time of Memorial Day. And honoring the ancestors um, in public ways didn't surprise anyone, even for what was a closeted familial tradition at that time. The ceremony, of course, was private, but as a time to pay homage to the ancestors, it was very convenient. So this is part of why it's set up that way. And what happens at illustration? A lot of things happen at illustration. And I've mentioned the actual lustral water and the blessing that comes with it as being the primary event of lustration. Arguably, even more so is the oracle of the ancestors, which is part of that blessing. So twice a year we receive publicly the oracle of the ancestors. Now, privately, the first priesthood are constantly talking to the ancestors, or at least they certainly should be. Certainly, our new first priesthood and our old first priesthood have always maintained strong ties to the ancestors. Um, this is very important in the Correllian tradition because we have that teaching that life does not end with death, nor does your involvement in what is happening in this tradition end with death. We continue to remain involved forever. It is a multi-generational process. And so at lustration, we invoke the ancestors, and they speak all together at once. They do not speak as I, they speak as we, and they tell us what they think is needful for us to know. And it, of course, like any oracle, is also subject to the ability of the person to bring it through. Now, at one time, we had a global lustration for the ancestors and a global lustration for the living. Now, today, the lustration of the living is done regionally. So there'll be many of them and many oracles coming at that time, but the illustration of the ancestors is still centralized with a single oracle, which is the guidance for the tradition for the year. It is an important event, and as the person who brought through these oracles for many years, I'll tell you it's also rather exhausting, but it's a very important event for the tradition as a whole. That the oracle and the blessing is the central event of the lustration ceremony, which normally happens on Sunday. And on this lustration will be happening on Sunday, as it usually does. But it's put in the center of what is now a very large ritual recapitulating Correllian teachings about the nature of incarnation and the universe. And it was created for that purpose, to be a recapitulation of Correllian teachings on the subject. If you know nothing about Correllianism, but you attend a lustration and you pay attention to the words of the lustration, you'll come away with a very good understanding of our theology because it is implicit in the entire ceremony. Um, the lustration of the living, which is done regionally, is a more attenuated ceremony than the lustration of the ancestors, but still is a recapitulation of our theology. And it was intended to be exactly that. It was intended to be an encyclopedic description of what the tradition believes. Now, if you ask me before 2002, is that the ceremony we did? No, we did much simpler ceremonies before that because everyone present already knew all of this. But when we made it a public ceremony, we really wanted to emphasize the deeper teachings of the tradition through the lustration ceremony. So The ceremony is it's definitely very high ceremony and happens only the one time a year in the sense of the lustration of the ancestors. And it is quite an event. And if you're watching on Facebook, and hello to Renee in the chat room who says, I'm looking forward to seeing everyone at Lustration. Yes, indeed. And we're looking forward to seeing you. But if you're watching Facebook, you'll see Correllians starting to put up all the things they're doing for Lustration. In fact, the first people have arrived from out of town already. And we want to say hello to Reverend Pam, Reverend Mary, and Reverend Dee Dee, who I had the pleasure of having dinner with last night. And people will be continuing to pour into Danville through the week for the purpose of this lustration. You'll see people putting up their new regalia that they're working on. You'll see people putting up various craft items that they're working on. At this very moment, people throughout the Correllian tradition are busy creating what will be the look of the event. And it is, in my opinion, a very beautiful event. So that kind of describes for you the lustration ceremony, but there are a couple of things to be said about the lustration ceremony and about the entire weekend. And one of them is that we work with very strong energy. Reverend Dee Dee recently wrote about this in beautiful detail. And hello to Ricardo in the chat room, and hello to Brenda in the chat room. And Brenda says, "Morning, Lord Don. See you soon." And Brenda is part of the team that is organizing this lustration through Pure Sanctuary Temple. But we work with very heavy energy, and one of my favorite lustrations one of my favorite lustration stories that I'll probably be repeating tomorrow is from our Salem lustration back in 2009. And what would go on to become a very prominent high priestess was at her very first lustration and was asked to do, I believe, the blessing of the salt in the water. And she was highly competent. She knew what she was doing. She came to the altar and she starts to do the blessing. She finds she's shaking like a leaf. And this woman is accustomed to public appearances. It's not like she's suffering from stage fright. And she's saying to herself, what's going on? And she ends up doing the blessing, taking up the conjoined salt and water, turns to the room, and everyone's doing this, projecting their energy towards her. A room full of Correllian high priesthood and archpriesthood. And she said it was some of the strongest energy she'd ever felt. Do be prepared for strong energy at a lustration. It is a very strong energy. Now, at this particular lustration, we also have another very special event happening. I've already talked about it at some length, but I'm going to mention it again now, which is the double investiture of the new first priesthood, Lady Alyssa and Lord Phoenix. That will be happening on Saturday. And the plan is that it will be happening on the banks of the Vermilion River, which is the sacred river of Correllian tradition. The Correllian tradition literally developed on the banks of the Vermilion River, not quite in the place we'll be using, but in the location known as Under the Hill, which was literally on the banks of the Vermilion River. And it will be using water directly from the Vermilion River. It is the first double investiture since 1979, or in 45 years. In 1979, it was Lady Crystal and myself who were invested. And I never thought that I would live to see another double investiture. But lo and behold, I have, and I'm actually really very pleased by that. For me, this is part of being confident about the future, of seeing the future taking shape while I'm still here to see it. And of course, I would see it as an ancestor, but it would be harder for me to take any kind of supporting role in it, although the ancestors are constantly there to support. But this time I'll actually be in the ceremony in a physical form, which I never thought was going to happen. So I'm looking forward to that in a bit of a bittersweet way. and it's going to be, I think, quite wonderful. And we will be talking probably at some point this week about the nature of the investiture ceremony as well. I can tell you that it's very much inspired by the alchemical great work, the alchemical marriage, and particularly the parts of the ceremony are reflecting that alchemical teaching. And if you look at Correllianism, and I would say if you look at Wicca as a whole, you'll find alchemy is all through it. Um, and if you look at the particulars of the investiture ceremony, this should be pretty obvious, particularly when it's explained. So for people coming to this lustration, they're also attending this very historic event. Um, who knows when there'll be another investiture of any sort, singular or double. I would not expect it, certainly in my own lifetime. And hello to Diane in the chat room. It's good to see you, Diane. And we certainly will be bringing you thorough coverage of all of these wonderful things. Now, other things happen at lustration as well. Sometimes there are classes. There'll be a number of classes at this lustration. At this lustration, there will also be several festive dinners, including a dinner for the Four Seasons and the Silent Supper, which is part of the investiture. And investiture begins by first honoring those who have gone before, the ancestors. Under normal circumstances, and hello to George in the chat room, it's good to see you, George. Under normal circumstances, someone would have died for this to be happening, presumably myself. As it happens, I'm not dead. But normally, you would have the ancestor ceremony specifically honoring the deceased member of the first priesthood whose replacement is being invested. However, since I'm still living, and since Lady Crystal is still living, the ancestor ceremony will honor all of the first priesthood that we have had over these many years. And it will honor them together as a group. And part of that is the Silent Supper, which is exactly the same kind of silent supper that you might see at a Samhain ceremony. It is meant to honor the spirits and begins the vigil of the first priesthood, who will be expected to remain in silence until the beginning of the actual ceremony the following morning in a vigil with the ancestors. We do make an exception for dealing with children, since Lady Alyssa has children. But generally, the only people they should be speaking to during this time are the spirits of the ancestors, who may have a lot to say to them. And that is the beginning of the investiture. We also are going to have a retirement party for me, because I am retired in office. That means I'm still one of the first priesthood, but I'm retired from daily duties. That will be happening Saturday night, and that should be quite the event. It will be having the Four Quarters Feast, which I think in and of itself is going to be breathtakingly memorable. I have a clue what's going to be served, and it is magnificent. There will also be, during the course of the weekend, a home-style barbecue in honor of the new first priesthood. And, it's going to be a great time. And of course, the other thing is there's always lots of social time set aside. Because one of the biggest aspects of a Correllian lustration is actually the social time. For most of our people who actually come to lustrations, this is the only time of year, sometimes the only time in several years, that they get to see other Correllians physically in the flesh and spend time talking to them in person. Now, they may talk daily online. I was speaking with Reverend Brenda and Reverend Pam last night, and they talk daily online. But it's wonderful for them to have the chance to be together personally at this time. And there's never anything quite like being able to give someone a hug, and just sitting in the same room with them. So for a lot of people, that's a big part of lustration. Um, Over and above all of the ceremonies, the classes, and whatever else is happening, spending time with each other, because we often say we're a family, and we feel that we're a family. We certainly began as a familial tradition, and for most people, lustration is a family reunion, and that's very much how they feel about it. And that's very much the atmosphere. A family reunion with very high ceremony thrown on top of it. Another thing that will be happening during the weekend is the temple deeming. And if you've never seen a temple deeming, the temple deeming is part of the Correllian temple making process. And the deeming happens at lustrations, and it is coordinated by the Templar Grand Deemster. Um, the actual Grand Deemster, the Lady Angela Munn, will not be physically present at this lustration because of things going on in her life, but the ceremony will be going forward. I believe we have 4 temples that are up for deeming. And what happens in the life of a Correllian temple is they begin as a Wittan shrine, and then they move up through the different temple rankings to eventually become a full temple as they develop the skills to run their organization. And the deeming is to determine whether they're ready to advance. And it is always very interesting to watch. You learn a lot about the tradition as you listen to the answers provided by the different temple heads. Some of the people up for deeming will be physically present. Some will be sending their answers to be read by others to the questions that are asked of them. It's possible some may be joining from video. That happens in some years. And it is, as I say, it's very informative, especially about the international groups. And we've learned, of course, we learn a lot in daily dealing with them. But sometimes, some of the things we discuss in deeming are the greatest challenges that have been faced. And it's not always things that you would think about, particularly when we're talking about other parts of the world. And so that's always a fascinating thing, and that will be happening. Um, Let me just check the schedule to make sure I'm telling you the right thing. That is happening on Friday, currently scheduled for 5 p.m. And it should be quite an interesting um, event for everyone. And George says, "Hello, Don. I've enjoyed watching your daily podcast and learning about your family's tradition." Thank you, George. That makes me very happy. It We plan to bring you lots of coverage of lustration this coming weekend. It is always a festive occasion, always a very joyful occasion, and I will have to say, how can I put this? After doing a lustration at the Parliament of the World's Religions in Toronto, someone did make an interesting comment that I think was a compliment, but she said that up until now, she had thought the Andreac Vein had the most complex rituals that she had seen, but they had nothing on the Correllians. And that does kind of describe illustration. Um, it is, as I say, the encapsulation of our theology. Um, Very, very big on pageantry, very big um, on visual aspects as well. And I've always felt personally that people like that strong visual presentation for certain things. Now, if you come to an ordinary Correllian ritual, it's going to be very laid back. We normally are. If I'm doing ritual, there aren't going to be robes. Um, there's not going to be a quote script. There probably will be an order of service. Everything will be done from the heart. It will be very spontaneous, very in the moment. Not every temple follows that pattern. Some are more formal. But generally speaking, in our ordinary rituals, we're very laid back. And for ordinary worship And for personal growth, I think that's very important. I'm not a great believer in scripted ritual for your ordinary use. Lustrations are very different, but they're very special. And as I say, the lustration of the ancestors is once a year and often involves people who have not had any chance to rehearse it. Sometimes they get their part right before it starts because it's not uncommon someone will not be there at the last minute for one reason or another. Sometimes even very important parts have had to be switched out at the last moment because someone was ill on that particular day, or there was a traffic problem, or all kinds of different things. So it is a much more scripted ritual, but it is, I think, a very memorable one. And the fact that it is the same ritual, more or less, every time, I think does give it a certain power of its own. So if you go to our Correllian TV archives, you can look back at Correllian Lustrations for 19 years and see the different ways they've been staged, the different developments, how certain things have changed. And, I mentioned we did the first public lustration in 2002. But the ceremony has certainly evolved since then. And one of the ways that it evolved is it involves far more people because we found so many people were coming from it that we wanted to involve as many people as we could. I think the largest number of ritualists illustration has ever involved was 46. And that was very memorable. Um, it is it is very much a group effort. So I hope you'll join us for the coverage of that. Now, tomorrow, I am going to be talking about memorable lustration events from the past. I told my story about the 2009 lustration today. It might get told again. But there are so many other things I can talk about. I can talk about the time we had picketers, for example. I can talk about the time we had evangelical Christians banging on the door. I think I will talk about that. But I can also talk about so many wonderful things that have happened at lustration. The one thing that's always true is that there's scarcely a minute to breathe from the time it opens to the time it ends. And something is always happening. And so I say we plan to bring you lots of coverage. We plan to bring you live streaming of the major events. We plan to bring you interviews with important personages from the event and with many people from the event. I believe we're planning to do Tarot Thursday live from the location. And at this moment, my intention is to do my Thursday and Friday broadcast live from Lustration. And this is only the beginning of the wonderful coverage we'll be bringing you. And so I hope that you enjoy it. I see we've come to the end of our half hour. And tomorrow, again, I'll be talking about interesting stories from illustrations. And there's certainly been enough years to have lots of interesting stories. And so join me tomorrow for that. If you want to learn more about lustration, again, you can go to correllian.com/lustration-2024.html. And if you would like to support my work, you can do so through my Patreon at revdonlewis.com. And I hope that we will see you in person at this weekend's lustration or online through our coverage. And with that, we will close with our prayer as we always do. Divine Mother Goddess, Divine Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you for all that you do for us in our lives, and we ask you to continue to be with us and to guide us as we go forward. Beloved ones, we rejoice in this walk we walk together, and we treasure you in our hearts as we know you treasure us. Beloved ones, with great love and thanks and respect, and knowing you are always with us, but from respect, we thank you for your presence, and may you be blessed now and always. And I'll see you